This is Snake.
Oh, hi, Snake. How's it going? It's been a while.
What do you mean?
Come on, Snake. We go way back. You know, with all the Metal Gears and the metal. You know, the Sniper Wolf and the.
What the hell are you talking about?
When it comes to dickhead publishers, few can compete with Konami over the past 10 years or so. From terrible cash-ins to the mistreatment of staff to outright offensive pachinko machines and everything in between, there are few companies in the games industry right now considered more villainous. But what makes all of this so much worse is that not so long ago, Konami was producing literally some of the best video games ever made. Suikoden, Silent Hill, Castlevania, hell, even Pro Evolution Soccer, the list goes on and on. And yet, all of these once genre-defining IPs have either been forgotten completely or are being pimped out as nostalgia bait for pachinko machines and free-to-play gacha garbage. But of all the franchises that experienced the rise and fall of Konami, few sting as hard as Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear is, for many, myself included, one of the greatest game franchises ever created. After an admittedly smaller start with Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, it will be 1998's Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation 1 that would really put the franchise on the map. Existing as a blend of ideas and concepts, many from the history of spy thrillers and other American movies of the late 1970s through to the late 1980s, Metal Gear Solid was a milestone in design, storytelling and atmosphere, somehow blending stealth gameplay with tactical action and including fresh concepts that had never been seen before in gaming. In short, it single-handedly showed that games could both be cinematic whilst also existing as their own medium. In the years since, Metal Gear has gone on to become a huge IP, with 5 beloved mainline entries and countless spin-offs that continue to push the boundaries of cinematic storytelling and player engagement, right up until Konami fucked everything up and then released a shitty, half-baked survival game to chase trends and cash in on the Fox engine. But before Survive finally killed Metal Gear for good, it was an ever-changing and monumentally interesting franchise. While I'd never claim that these games were perfect, with many of the storytelling ideas and concepts often devolving into gloriously convoluted nonsense, and the pacing sometimes feeling a little bit too cinematically driven, I, like many others, still loved these games so much. But what would you say if I told you there was another Metal Gear game that was just as interesting, off the wall, and refreshing as some of the most famous in the series? And then what if I told you that it was a game that you probably hadn't played, or you'd forgotten existed altogether? Am I here to tell you those things? Yes, Metal Gear Acid is a PSP exclusive, first released in 2004 in Japan and 2005 in the rest of the world. Interestingly, it was developed completely in-house by Konami. However, series mastermind and director of all previous mainline entries, Hideo Kojima, would vacate the director's chair for this spin-off, making way for his longtime collaborator and fellow Metal Gear alumni, Shintaro Nojiri. Interestingly, while Kojima would still act as producer on the project, little is known about how much influence he actually had on the game's development. Nojiri, who had worked on Metal Gear 2 and 3 before this, had also worked on Kojima's previous, lesser-known title, Police Nauts, another hodgepodge of concepts and imagery, mined this time almost exclusively from 1980s American science fiction cinema. Also, as well as serving on the Metal Gear team for the last few entries, Nojiri had also been game director on Metal Gear Solid Ghost Babel. In an interesting aside, this Game Boy game, which was simply titled Metal Gear Solid outside of Japan, was not, as many assumed, a retelling of the PlayStation game on Game Boy, and was instead a completely different story that took place in an alternate timeline after the events of the original Metal Gear games. Essentially, it was a what-if scenario that occurred instead of Metal Gear Solid. Like an alternate version of those events, I guess, played out differently. So here's Metal Gear 1 and 2, and then there's a split and we get 2 timelines, where both of these games kind of play out simultaneously, one in each. Now, we'll return to why this point is important later on, but for now, just keep that in mind. As for Nojiri himself, little is known about what he's been doing for the last decade. It seems he still works at Konami, but his last credit was as a director on the 2012 action game, Never Dead, which I remember coming out, but I'm not sure I've ever met anyone who actually played it. Still, wherever he is, I hope he's doing well. I mean, I hope he's not locked in Konami's NFT dungeon or something. Or handing out towels in their health clubs. Perhaps almost as shadowy and difficult to unearth as information on Acid's director is information on the game's production in general. While it's clear that it was being developed alongside Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, as both games would launch in Japan within less than a month of each other, little else is known about the game's inception, writing, or budget. While certain inferences can be made, such as the reuse of some assets in the same engine from Metal Gear 2 to cut down development time, and the general idea of Sony wanting a must-have Metal Gear title for their new handheld console, the PSP, which actually saw release the same day as Acid, but other than these few tidbits, neither Kojima nor Nojuri have spoken much about the game's development, either at the time or in the years since release. One of the only things I could find when researching for this video was a promotional puff piece released in the summer of 2004, which gave a little interesting insight into the game's name. Now, when I first saw the name Metal Gear Acid, I assumed it was referring to some kind of drug-induced trip. You know, like when people say, it's like that thing, but on acid. It's Metal Gear, but on acid. Now, thinking about this as a more fully formed adult, it's kind of clear to me that Metal Gear always felt like it was on acid. Do you know what I mean?
Are you a Navy SEAL? How did you get in?
Fast rope descent from a Navy chopper.
So, according to Nojiri, the title Metal Gear Acid actually refers to 3 different elements in reference to the game. One is the game's main gameplay system, which has been dubbed the Active Command Intelligence Dual System. Now, I've beaten this game multiple times, and I just put in another 20 hours before writing this review, and I don't remember seeing this acronym once in-game. Now, maybe I missed it, but maybe he just made this shit up for the interview. The second refers to a specific plot element that I'll explain more about in a little bit when we start talking about the story. Although, if I'm honest, this one also feels made up, but maybe see what you think when we get there. The final reference point, though, probably seems the most plausible, even if it is once again kinda weird. Basically, as this was designed as a diversion from all other Metal Gear games, according to Nojiri, the name Acid was supposed to be in reference to the idea that acid melts metal, and therefore Metal Gear as a concept was being melted down and reformed into something new. Now, I'm not sure if that's complete bullshit or not, but it's at the very least interesting. The story begins in the far-flung future of 2016, long after the events of the original Metal Gear games, Metal Gear Solid 1 and Metal Gear Solid 2. But here is where things already get a little hazy. You see, unlike the Snake that we meet in Metal Gear Solid 4, who has succumbed to rapid aging brought on by the science that birthed him as a clone of Big Boss, the Snake we meet at the beginning of Acid is a much younger looking, healthier version. So, I think I know what you're thinking. Maybe Metal Gear 4 just takes place after Metal Gear Acid, right? Well, that's where you're wrong, as Metal Gear Solid 4 takes place in 2014. And Acid, as mentioned previously, takes place in 2016. Now, at the time Acid was released, Metal Gear 4 didn't exist, and Metal Gear Solid 3 was the latest installment in the franchise. Whether Acid was meant to ever be canon or not isn't really clear, but what is clear is that it certainly hasn't been treated as such in the years since its release back in 2004, even seeing complete omission from the official Metal Gear database that was released for Metal Gear 4 back in June of 2008. With all this in mind, it's best to approach Metal Gear Acid in a similar way to Ghost Babel. It's essentially an alternate version of the years after Metal Gear Solid 2 in the timeline. Another what-if scenario that chimes with what we talked about earlier, with Nojiri's last foray into this property. Basically, what Acid is to Metal Gear 4 is what Ghost Babel was to Metal Gear Solid, if that makes sense. Now, I've seen a few people say that they think Acid is the events of Metal Gear 4 in the same timeline as Ghost Babel, but I couldn't find a lot of evidence in the game to support this, and the little that is there seems to indicate that Metal Gear Solid 2 happened, so I don't know, but either way it's interesting. Anyway, back to the story at hand. After setting the scene with a mysterious clandestine meeting of clearly powerful individuals, the game kicks off with a hijacking of a passenger plane, which also happens to be playing host to a US presidential candidate named Vigo Hatch. Utilizing an acid-based paralyzing gas, which is also the other acid reference I mentioned earlier, the hijackers, whose identities remain a mystery for now, claim to have also placed a bomb on the flight and demand something known as Pythagoras in the next 12 hours or the plane will be obliterated. While little is known about Pythagoras, it seems to be the subject of a research project currently being run out of a fictional South African country named the Maloney Republic and funded by a huge American-owned conglomerate hilariously named Beagle. In an attempt to regain control of the situation and uncover information about whatever Pythagoras might be, the United States dispatches an elite squad to the research facility in Maloney, but loses contact with them shortly afterward. With most other alternatives exhausted and the clock ticking, an old friend of Colonel Campbell named Roger McCoy contacts the now seemingly retired Solid Snake, who appears to be living a life of seclusion in the mountains. After agreeing to take the job, Snake embarks on a story that balances genuine surprises, twists, and intrigue with ridiculous eccentricities in that very specific way that only Metal Gear can seem to pull off. As Snake ventures deeper into the facility, what he finds begins to make him question his very existence and persona, and such trials test his resolve, eventually leading him to accept help and team up with another operative named Teleco. Teleco, the last member of the original team that was sent in to secure Pythagoras, also has her own motivations and a mysterious past that is somehow connected to Roger, the facility, and Snake himself. Now, despite Kojima acting as producer, his general dismissal of the Acid games leads me to believe that he doesn't really consider them much when thinking about Metal Gear as a whole. But despite this, it's really surprising just how authentic the story in Metal Gear Acid feels. I mean, there are movie references like a giant mercenary named Leone and a mysterious doctor named Fleming, both clear homages to Sergio Leone and Ian Fleming, two auteurs of popular culture who shaped both the cinematic landscape and the spy espionage genre respectively. These kinds of clear references are rife in the Metal Gear franchise, with Snake himself being borderline plagiarized from John Carpenter's classic 1982 movie, Escape from New York, a connection that I actually couldn't believe Kojima got away with in Metal Gear 2, when he started calling himself Pliskin.
My name is Pliskin.
Call me Snake.
About an hour ago, a small jet went down inside New York City. The president was on board.
Call me Snake.
S.D. Pliskin.
My name is Pliskin.
I don't give a fuck.
And just look at the cover art for the original Metal Gear and tell me that isn't Michael Biehn from the Terminator. On top of these references, Acid also contains a crazy, off-the-wall rogues gallery of other characters that would feel right at home in the mainline series. I mean, this game has a pair of talking puppets that hijack a plane, a psychic ritual, a master of disguise called Le Clown, who, at one point in the game, forces you to play a Squid Game-style life-size board game of death. But it's all just played so unbelievably straight, and no one ever winks at the camera or acknowledges how ridiculous these things are, in a world that is generally akin to a Tom Clancy novel. Now, this series has been around long enough that you probably know if you like this stuff or not, but as a huge fan of it myself, I just want to reiterate that all of this feels extremely authentic in Metal Gear Acid, and while some of the set pieces are hindered by the platform of choice, its year of release, and its existence as a non-canon spin-off, this is a Metal Gear story where it counts. In fact, I would say that in some ways, its more text-heavy visual-based presentation, we'll talk more about that in a bit, actually gives the story a bit more of a grounded feel in some instances, and this allows for some truly intimate and unexpected twists. Now, before we go on any further, I think it's also worth noting that it wasn't really made clear at the time of release, at least in the West, that this game was in fact non-canon. Essentially, this meant many, myself included, first played this game unsure if it was or wasn't a canonical sequel to Sons of Liberty. What this meant for the game was it was free to treat Snake however it wanted, within reason. And what this meant for the player was a genuine feeling that they didn't know what was coming next, and also a feeling that they may not have known Snake as well as they thought they did. It really was an interesting dynamic that allowed for the creation of themes, content, and risks not often seen in the mainline series. Taken together, what all of this creates is a fantastic, interesting, and addictive story that I'm sure will resonate with most Metal Gear fans out there. While, as always, the usual staples are there, like needlessly convoluted sections and borderline ridiculous characters, all of it serves to enthrall and delight, despite making little attempt to convert those that have never liked the series' unique narrative style. However, it's an unfortunate truth that Metal Gear Acid's story is far from perfect. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail here, as, despite its flaws, I do still think it's one of the game's best qualities, and it's also best experienced, knowing little more than I've told you already going in. But with all that said, there are a few general criticisms to talk about. For starters, the structure is a little bit weird, especially in the game's first third. Essentially, what it does is it keeps showing you a mystery and then immediately cutting to a day or two before and explaining that mystery in the very next scene. What this means is, rather than planting some interesting seeds and questions that can have satisfying payoffs later in the game, it just gives you the payoff in the very next scene, which starts to make you wonder why they'd set up the structure this way in the first place. Now, to be clear on this point, this is not the case for all the game's many mysteries, and there are plenty of examples of great setup and payoff throughout the lengthy campaign. It's more a criticism of the game's opening act, which just jumps around a little bit too much for its own good. Secondly, and this might sound a bit weird, but bear with me, the game contains a few elements that seem to only exist because they are known or infamous within the series itself. Again, I don't want to go into specifics for fear of spoiling anything, but there's more than one occasion where the game feels like it's putting something in just because it, quote, wouldn't be a Metal Gear game without it. And more often than not, the presentation, writing, tone, and style would have been enough to make this feel like Metal Gear without those things. Also, while I'm sure not everyone will agree, I do feel like this game might have one too many storylines going on at once. Now, to be fair, they do all come together in the end, but the way the focus is placed on each throughout the story make it hard to be invested an equal amount in all of them. Essentially, you have the mission to get Pythagoras and the research facility, what's happening on the plane with the weird puppets and the hostages, the presidential candidate and the bomb, and then what's going on with Snake and Teleco. Now, while all three are fine and do connect in significant ways, I think there's an unnecessary amount of time spent on the plane scenario, introducing characters that either do very little till the end of the game, or are just not that interesting. Now, I get that the plane hijacking is the catalyst for this story, but the game literally cuts back there all the time, often for lengthy sequences, and because you never actually control anyone on board or see the plane outside of these visual novel sequences, it just feels a little disconnected from the other stuff that's going on. However, Metal Gear Acid's biggest storytelling problems lay in its lack of willingness to fully commit to some of its incredible and bold ideas, especially when it comes to Snake and his story arc. As I've said a few times now, I really don't want to spoil anything, but there are parts in this game where you genuinely believe that you've never truly known who Snake is or what he's capable of. And while many would inevitably decry questioning the moral character and motivations of such a beloved protagonist, Acid's existence as a non-canon spin-off allows it that luxury without truly upsetting the masses. As it stands, however, most of these ideas end up forgotten, walked back, or bailed out of by the time the credits roll, which is a real shame. Also, while a Metal Gear story becoming very convoluted is now a staple that the series wears with pride and is almost expected at this point, Acid does push this to its limits, and by the end of the game, it's clear that the need for more twists and unexpected events overwhelms the storytelling resolve just a little bit. But having said all of this, Metal Gear Acid is nonetheless, in my opinion at least, almost worth playing for its story alone, especially if you're a fan of the franchise. It's authentic, interesting, weird, and filled with twists and turns that you won't see coming. And while it might ultimately leave you feeling a little deflated by the time the credits roll, it's definitely an experience that's more about the journey than the destination. Snake? Snake? Snake, answer me! Snake!
What happened?
Oh, you're fine. Sorry about shouting. Unlike some of the other Metal Gear spin-offs, including this game's own sequel, Metal Gear Acid 2, which went for a much more stylized, cel-shaded look, Metal Gear Acid 1 is very clearly attempting to match its aesthetics with those of the series' PS2 era. For the most part, this makes sense, given that Metal Gear Acid was developed in the same engine as Metal Gear Solid 2, and even reused many of the same assets, no doubt allowing for a quicker and more efficient turnaround when it came to development time. But even taking this into consideration, I think Acid is a pretty good looking game, especially for a PSP launch title, and its new character models and assets match seamlessly with any that are reused from Metal Gear Solid 2. Also, it's worth noting overall that this is far more than just an asset flip, and there are many new areas and sequences that obviously took a lot of care and attention to create. Having said this though, the videos from other Metal Gear games that play when you use a special character card, more on those in a little bit, do look kinda bad as they're very clearly compressed video files. Now, while this was a little more forgivable back when the game launched, they still looked kinda shit back then too if I'm honest, and they also just start to get annoying after a little while. Luckily, they're easily skippable and can be turned off in the options menu, if you don't fancy reliving your childhood memories through what feels like the bottom of a Vaseline smeared pint glass. Now, aside from the normal gameplay areas and short in-game cutscenes, a lot of your time throughout Metal Gear Acid will be spent in visual novel style sections. So I'll talk a bit more about these in a little bit, but just to focus on the art for a second, most of these look pretty great and really suit the smaller PSP screen in particular. The only real problem is that some of the character portraits don't match up to their 3D counterparts, like, at all. I mean, look at Teleco's visual novel image, and then look at her character model.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What the fuck is that?
Still, this example is one of the outliers, and many of the others fare much better and are much more seamless. The only other thing regarding how the player interacts with the game's visuals is the camera, which can be a little finicky and frustrating at times. While you can use the thumbstick to look around, rotate, and zoom in and out to an extent, the way the camera moves sometimes seems to fight with the environments, especially in more confined areas. As such, what can occasionally happen is that you can move somewhere and get seen by an enemy or a camera that you didn't even know was there, because there was literally no way of positioning the camera to make seeing it possible. Having said this though, this complaint again is quite minor and doesn't happen all that often. Also, I guess this is kind of compounded by the fact that any choice you make in this game is final, and while I'll go over the actions you can take in a little bit, what I mean by this is if you choose to move somewhere, then you've moved there and you can't undo that part of your turn. As such, if you do get caught out because the camera is being an absolute dick, your choices will be to stand and fight or reload your save, which, again as I'll discuss in a little bit, isn't as easy as it should be in Metal Gear Acid. When it comes to music, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that the music here is fantastic and feels completely in sync with the rest of the series. The bad news is there's not very much of it. Often you'll find the same music being looped over and over, or being reused in several different sequences. And while there are a few character themes that set the tone almost perfectly, especially in the visual novel sections, they are unfortunately so rare that you'll spend much more of your time noticing the other reused tracks than appreciating them. Sound effects are also clearly reused from previous titles in the series, and while there are a few new additions, everything on this front is serviceable at least, if a little bit underworked. All in all though, there's very little to moan about when it comes to how this game looks and sounds, especially when you consider the budget and time constraints that were no doubt in place during production. So now we come to the gameplay, and it's here that Metal Gear Acid shows the biggest divergence from almost all other games in the series. Essentially, the game is broken down into 3 different gameplay sections. These are the visual novel sections mentioned earlier, the missions themselves, which play out almost like a turn-based JRPG with a card gimmick, and the prep phase, which allows for card deck customization and various other options. So, as we already mentioned them, let's talk about the visual novel sections first. These are pretty much as bare bones as you can get when it comes to this style of game. They play out as a sequence of static art with music for atmosphere and the occasional sound effect. There is no voice acting and no player choice here. You simply look at the images, read the story, and press the circle button for the next line of dialogue, barring a few weird sections where the game skips on dialogue for you for some reason. Now, while as I said earlier, the story and writing are interesting, eccentric, and weird in a good way, this will not be for everyone. And this last playthrough in particular really reminded me just how much time you spend reading exposition in this game. I would say that at least 50%, maybe more, of the game is spent in these sequences. And so, if the story doesn't grab you, well, then you might be in for a bad time. Also, while the translation is pretty good for the most part, there are a few mistakes or weird lines here and there. And the lack of voice acting can also make certain lines of dialogue feel extra weird. Now, normally I don't mind no voice acting, and in some games I actually prefer it, but actors like David Hayter have always been able to give some of this wacky shit some believable gravitas, and here, that is occasionally missing. Next, we have the meat of the gameplay, the turn-based missions. Now, I know that it might be easy to scoff at these, and a lot of fans of the series probably hate the idea of a turn-based Metal Gear game that uses cards, but actually, this system is not only one of the game's greatest strengths, it also somehow manages to capture the Metal Gear feel, even though it plays so differently. So the first thing to say here is the cards, while very important, are not as intrinsic to the overall experience as you might think. This isn't Gwent or Hearthstone. In those games, you often live or die by your deck and the cards dealt, and the whole experience is just laying cards on the table. In Metal Gear Acid, while there is an element of this for sure, the cards are just one small part of a larger gameplay model, which has many other factors to contend with as you play. I guess the best way to think of it is, imagine you're playing a game like XCOM. Now imagine that instead of a combat-focused experience, the gameplay goals are the same as they are in any other Metal Gear game. Sneaking around, obtaining items, not being seen, getting disguises, etc, etc. Now imagine that your movement and some of your moves are fixed in a deck of cards, 6 of which are provided to you per turn. This means that you can always move and often act, but what you do and how you do it might change based on the enemy placement, the enemy types, the layout of the map, the objective, and also the cards you've been dealt. But how does all this work really? Well, I'll do my best to break it down for you. Firstly, movement is grid-based, just like the aforementioned XCOM. However, unlike XCOM, turn order is not one at a time, and represents the first wrinkle in Metal Gear Acid's combat system, but more on that in a little bit. Both the player's characters, which is just Snake at the start of the game, with Teleco joining later on, have a deck of cards each, which is customizable in between missions. Now, every time it's your character's turn, their hand will be dealt an initial 6 cards, which will stay in their hand unless they're used or discarded. When you use or discard a card, it will go back to the bottom of the pile and be removed from your hand. Every time your turn comes around again, 2 random cards are drawn from that character's deck and placed into your hand, in order to replace those that you might have used in previous turns. Now, each of these cards have a different use or effect, and all but some selected ones can also be used to move. Some will be weapons used to attack, some will be buffs and debuffs or rations to restore your health, and so on and so forth. On top of this, there are also movement cards that are simply used to move, special character cards that do stuff like huge attacks or give a huge buff, and equipable cards which either add new elements like armor or stealth to a character or equip them with weapons that can be used offensively. Now, remember I mentioned the turn order earlier? Well, almost every single card in Metal Gear Acid has a number in the top right corner. This number is added to a total per character meter when it is used, and whatever that number ends up at the end of that character's turn will dictate how long they must wait before acting again. So, for example, if during my turn when using Snake, I use a movement card to move, which has a value of 4, and then a usable weapon card to attack an enemy that has a value of 6, my total at the end of that turn will be 10. And so, I will have to wait for any enemy that has a lower number than 10 after they've used their cards before I can act again. This system becomes even more nuanced when you consider other elements, such as the difference between Snake and Teleco. You see, Snake has more HP, but can only act twice per turn. Teleco, on the other hand, has less health, but can act 3 times per turn, giving her a much lighter feel. Having said this, like Snake, she'll only have 2 of those cards replaced at the beginning of her next turn, potentially giving her less choice. And also, using more cards in a turn increases your wait number, meaning she might have to wait for everyone else to act before playing another card. It's also worth noting that if you choose not to act with a character in a turn, then the number 4 will be added to your wait meter automatically, meaning that enemies will eventually be able to act if you just stand still for too long. Also, once you use all of the cards in your deck, it will reset, meaning you'll never actually run out, and ones that you've already used will come back around again. However, when your deck resets, you also get 10 points added to your wait number. All of these systems are also applied to enemies and their decks. On top of all of this, there are also cards that can reduce your wait number and the wait number of your ally, meaning that if you set your hand up correctly, or you just get lucky, you can reduce it to 0 and essentially give yourself multiple turns before the enemy can act again. Speaking of setting up your hand, this is where the mission prep section of the game comes into play. Between mission stages and the visual novel sections, you'll be taken to another menu-based screen. Here, you're given multiple options to tailor your gameplay for the next mission, such as customizing each character's deck. At the start of the game, you're only given a deck size of 30, but this incrementally increases as you hit story milestones, along with your health. Also, as you complete missions, you are given a rating, which, depending on how good it is, will award you with a certain amount of points. These points are used in the game's card shop to buy new cards and expand the options in your deck. Also, a short ways into the game, you're given the option of replaying missions you've already beaten with new objectives in order to farm more points to buy more cards. As a quick aside here, I'm not really sure what the game wants in order to get an S rank, but I found that staying out of conflict as much as possible yielded the best results for me. Buying cards for your deck is presented in 2 ways. You can either buy single cards that are random and refresh every 2 missions or so, or you can buy packs of cards, which will contain 3, from whichever associated game. At the start of the game, the only option is Metal Gear Solid, but new packs soon become available for Metal Gear Solid 2, 3, and the series' past, with these hilarious and frankly weird introduction sequences.
Are you satisfied with your MGS1 pack? Of course you're not. There's always something better for you. It's the all-new MGS 2 pack. The M9 tranquilizer, hanging, and even headshots. You can't escape the attack of the enhancements. Check the local card shop during intermission.
What the fuck is that?
You're also able to find packs of cards during missions, either hidden somewhere on the map or occasionally dropped by defeated enemies. Finally, you're also sometimes rewarded bonus cards at the end of a mission, and you even get a few as part of the story. In general, the way the cards work is pretty similar to any trading card game that you might have come across, with rare shiny versions sometimes appearing that have better stats than their non-shiny counterparts, and a large numbered album to try and track them all. All of this does a pretty good job of replicating that dopamine hit when you get a new shiny card or a favoured character to try in your next mission, and I'm sure many collectors and completionists will both enjoy and despise the challenge of trying to get every card in the game. Now, I know all of this sounds really complicated, but it's actually introduced to the player very gradually throughout the game's first third, with the use of short and to-the-point tutorials dropping most of the time just infrequently enough to avoid annoying the player. Once you grasp the systems at play here though, it can be such a unique, fun, challenging experience, with so many interesting elements to consider each time you embark on a new mission, and every mission playing out slightly differently each time. Also, it really makes you consider your options and think about your game plan. Missions get quite hard in this game, especially if you don't prepare, and several times throughout the lengthy campaign, you'll find yourself getting destroyed, only to go back, change your deck, develop your tactics, and return to breeze through a mission that so recently felt completely impossible. Speaking of the missions, special commendation should also be given to their design, which, for the most part, are really interesting and diverse. A big pitfall with a lot of tactics, turn-based style games is that mission objectives can often become stale or samey, usually devolving into kill all the enemies or get to this point on the map. Now, while Metal Gear Acid does have missions that use these tried and tested objectives, they're mixed in with other more interesting and creative ideas, like crazy boss fights, getting a disguise to allow you to get through an area, or retrieving an item in order to progress. However, having said all of this, it does have to be said that Metal Gear Acid isn't quite a perfect game when it comes to designing gameplay either. And while the byproduct of all of these systems and different moving parts is more often than not a unique, interesting and fun experience, there are a few issues worth pointing out. Firstly, because of the random nature of the card system and some of the mission structures, you can find yourself waiting several turns for a specific card to appear in your hand, discarding other cards to make room every single turn, and not being able to progress at all until that one card comes up. Secondly, there's no option to restart the mission or restart from a checkpoint in the game's pause menu, meaning if things go south or you want to restart from either of these points, you're forced to either quit to main menu and load a save, or let yourself be killed and then choose continue. Now, this is less of a problem if you're using emulation and save states, which almost entirely removes the issue. But I guess that wasn't how the game was initially designed to be played, so the criticism is still kind of valid. Either way, if you do use save states, despite being a filthy casual, you'll probably have a much better time. I'm only joking, you're not a filthy casual, play however you want. You little bitch. Thirdly, we should talk briefly about the enemy AI. For the most part, enemies are surprisingly intelligent and observant, often utilising varied tactics to flank the player or get the upper hand. However, occasionally, they seem to randomly just turn into complete fucking morons for no reason. Like, there were several times when I was in the middle of a firefight with a group of enemies, only for them to suddenly stop attacking and leave the room, and then fail to be able to find me again, even though I hadn't moved at all. It's impossible to really tell what causes this, and it happens so infrequently that most of the time it just ends up being hilarious. But it is still kinda weird and a bit of a shame, especially when you consider the rest of the time the enemies can provide a bit of a challenge. Fourthly, I hate to say it, but the game's main missions are guilty of a little bit too much backtracking on occasion. Now, don't worry, it's not egregious enough to ruin the game or anything, but I just think Acid could have been a much tighter experience had there been a little less returning to previously played mission areas that are basically the same but have new enemy types, or other little minor differences. I mean, if you like that stuff, you can always just play the side missions over and over, and it came across a little bit like padding. Still, as I said before, it just about gets away with it here, and while the pacing might feel strained at times, I can say that I was never bored. And finally, I just want to say a brief word about this game's final boss, which, while I won't show you here to avoid spoilers, can be a real dick if you don't have some very specific cards in your deck. Now, while the balancing is generally quite decent, so you might be able to beat this boss with whatever cards you've gathered along the way, doing it this way can take a really long time, like over an hour, maybe 2. Also, while there are other times throughout the game where you're forced to play 2 or 3 long mission sections at once without a chance to save in between, the nature of this last boss encounter is such that you can beat its first form but might be under-equipped or missing the right cards for its second form, meaning that even save states won't help you here. You little bitch. Essentially, this is the only time where the game can put you in an unwinnable state after upwards of an hour plus of play. And that is some straight up bullshit. Also, farming the cards that you need to avoid this is not fun or easy either, as it's almost completely RNG which ones you get from the shop. and even save scumming doesn't really work, with only the odd variation coming up each time you reload. What all of this means is that unless luck is on your side, the last boss can be a real fucker to beat, mainly due to its structure, the sheer length of the fight, and its different phases. While it is fun to develop a setup that works from the cards you have, just be warned that a couple of RPGs and some sniper rifles for Snake, chaff grenades and usable weapons for Teleco, and a bunch of time reducers on both of them will make your life a hell of a lot easier. He's not going to answer, is he? That's fair, he's probably busy. So, we've talked at length about the game's development, its story, its presentation, and its design. So let's talk a little bit about how it runs, how long it takes to beat, and also how much replay value it has. In terms of bugs, I haven't really run into many throughout all of my playthroughs over the years, and this most recent one was no different. There was the occasional camera glitch, clipping error, or AI weirdness, but all of these were pretty minor. The only other issue that I came across was that the game sometimes won't play by its own rules. Like, an enemy will see you through a wall or from a ridiculous distance for no reason. Or, even when disguised, an enemy who should be ignoring you will just attack you anyway. Still, these instances are very rare, and I'm sure that many will play through the entire game without running into any of them. Also, the game runs pretty well on original hardware, and even better through emulation, with much less slowdown for the majority, but due to its turn-based nature, any such occurrences on a PSP itself cause little to no issues. In terms of playtime, it took me around 20 hours to beat, which I think is about average if you take your time, read all the dialogue, play a few optional missions to farm cards, and go out of your way to grab a few hidden packs. Also, I can imagine you can triple, if not quadruple this playtime if you wanted to get an S rank on every mission and collect every card. Once you beat the game, you unlock a New Game Plus mode, which allows you to carry over your deck, barring a few story-related cards, to a new playthrough, a new hard difficulty, which provides an even steeper challenge, and also the ability to link Metal Gear Acid to Metal Gear Solid 3 via a link cable, to unlock a special weapon in the PS2 Masterpiece. On top of this, there's also a multiplayer mode which works via PSP Link, but due to my lack of friends, and also playing mainly through emulation this time, I haven't really tested this out, I'm afraid. Still, if you do have a friend who also owns a PSP and a copy of Acid, then I guess it's something else to try out. Feel free to let everyone know in the comments if you are familiar with this mode and how good it is. Also feel free to let me know in the comments what it's like to have friends. But all in all, when it comes to length, despite occasionally feeling drawn out, Metal Gear Acid is a meaty experience that will generally enthrall and amuse throughout. Despite its slower pace, this was one of the longest games in the series before the release of Peace Walker and The Phantom Pain, and it remains great value for money, especially if you gel with its unique systems and gameplay that diverge wildly from the series' norms, despite somehow still feeling in keeping with them. And I guess when it comes down to it, that's the point to take away from this review. Metal Gear Acid won't be for everyone. Hell, it won't even be for every Metal Gear fan, but that doesn't mean it won't be for you. Its fantastic and authentic, if convoluted story, its weird eccentricities, its layered and deep gameplay, and its impressive presentation make it feel more like a Metal Gear game than it should, especially given its existence as a portable spin-off developed with minimal involvement from the series' creator. It's immersive, challenging, interesting, weird, and wonderful, and while it doesn't quite stick the landing and has more than a few issues, it's still a worthy entry in the series for me. In a world where Konami think Metal Gear Survive is an acceptable spin-off to this once great franchise, Metal Gear Acid stands tall and also remains as perhaps a hidden gem for some who may have missed it or neglected it due to its design philosophies or portable spin-off status. It's true that not everyone will like Metal Gear Acid, and trust me, I get it. Even for this series and being outside of the main canon, it's a weird way to take things. But if you've never played it, if you love turn-based tactics games, or if you're a fan of the series who's looking for a more authentic Metal Gear experience that has been lacking since Kojima's exodus from the franchise, then maybe give Metal Gear Acid a shot. I promise you that at the very least, it's interesting, and at the most, it's fucking awesome. Yep. He hates me.